one of these moments, one of these few moments, maybe only the second moment really in human history, when we face a test of such enormous dimension that to fail it would be terminal.
You know, the partition recommendation of 1947 was to be implemented only if it could be done peacefully.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Featured today is a portion of the acceptance speech given by Bill McKibben when he got the Gandhi Peace Award last month in Connecticut. He sums up the utter peril facing humanity from climate catastrophe and gives a rather humorous description of the origin of his group, 350.org. And then a tribute 5 years late. 105 years ago, on May 27th, 1908, Elmer Berger was born. In the 1940s, he was perhaps the most influential anti-Zionist rabbi in the country. He was a Reform rabbi, not an ultra-Orthodox. He was a liberal, not a leftist. He headed the American Council on Judaism until it was engulfed by the rising tide of Zionism after the so-called miracle victory of Israel in 1967. We'll show a bit of an interview. We begin in Hamden, Connecticut. The Gandhi Peace Award has been given out by Promoting Enduring Peace since the 1950s. Last year's winner was Amy Goodman. Bill McKibben was honored for his work in practically inventing climate activism.
Inspire you?
Want to just talk for a minute about exactly where we find ourselves. Because it really is at one of these moments, one of these few moments, maybe only the second moment really in human history, when we face a test of such enormous dimension that to fail it would be terminal. The first of these tests, one that so far, thanks to people like the people in this room, we've kind of, well, at least we've been passing more or less. The first of them came with the new 20th century technology of nuclear weapons and the understanding that all of a sudden it was within our power to change everything all at once. You know, the vision for me is always of Oppenheimer standing there at the first explosion at Alamogordo and looking up at this fireball and quoting from the Gita and saying, "We are become as gods, destroyers of worlds." And that had never been a possibility for human beings before, and all of a sudden it was. And so far, we have been able to head off that great trauma. So far, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we haven't done it again, which is a good sign, a sign of humans' ability to understand the danger they're in and then to do something about it. I think one reason we were able to do something about it was that it was easy for us to picture in our minds the effects of those huge explosions. You know, they made visceral sense to us. It was harder to imagine that the explosion of billions of pistons and billions of cylinders every hour of every day around this planet could have the same scale of effect, but in fact, that's what turns out to be happening. That's what climate change is. So far, we've put enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, burned enough coal and gas and oil to raise the temperature of the Earth 1 degree, which does not actually sound like that much. I mean, if the temperature changes 1 degree between the time we walked in and the time we walk out, none of us will be able to tell the difference. But it turns out that the Earth can tell the difference. It means that we're trapping about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface. Again, that doesn't sound like much. It's less than one of those small white Christmas tree lights per square meter of the Earth's surface, but there turn out to be a lot of square meters of the Earth's surface, and aggregated together, it turns into an enormous quantity of energy on the scale of several 100,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, that much energy. And we have a sense now of how much energy that adds up to because we can see its effects around us. A few days ago, got new cryosat data from the satellites that circle above the North Pole, and what they told us was we only have about 20% of the summer sea ice left in the Arctic that we did 40 years ago. 80% of it's gone. We smashed through every record for Arctic ice melt last summer. We broke the old record by about August 16th with a month to go. And by the time we were done, we really had broken one of the biggest physical features on Earth, and the other one's close behind. We're near the ocean here, the beautiful Atlantic, and this Connecticut shore is a particularly beautiful place. My wife went to school here. She grew up in Norwalk, and so I know secondhand at least a little bit. It's part of the world, and it's very beautiful, but the water out there is very different from when she was growing up. It's 30% more acidic because the chemistry of seawater changes as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. This had not even occurred to us 25 years ago when I wrote The End of Nature. The oceans are our metaphor for vastness. We did not think we could actually do much to them, certainly not change their pH, but we have. For those of us on land, the thing we notice first, I think, is changes in hydrology, in the way that water moves around the planet. If you want one fact to understand our century, it's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. As a result, the atmosphere is 5% wetter than it was. That's a lot. That's a staggering change in a basic physical parameter. It loads the dice for drought and flood, and we are seeing both in astonishing quantities every day someplace around the world. We've seen epic droughts in Africa. We've seen last summer's remarkable drought across the richest farmland in the world, and we've also seen rainstorms of completely unprecedented proportion, place after place after place. This afternoon, apparently, it was Chicago's turn, and they had rained like more than they'd ever measured at this time of the year in the whole history of the place, and causing enormous quick flooding. The week before that, it was Buenos Aires. They had what they described as a tsunami of rainfall, a completely unprecedented event. 50 or 60 people died, drowned in their cars, And it's always like this now someplace around the world, and sometimes much worse. In 2010, record rainfall along the headwaters of the Indus River up in the mountains of Pakistan. And by the time that it worked its way down across the whole nation, 25% of Pakistan was underwater. 20 million people were out of their homes. It's as if Hurricane Sandy had made everybody from Baltimore to Boston, have to evacuate their houses. But of course, Hurricane Sandy was bad enough. It was certainly a reminder to us of what's going on, to see the greatest city in the world, to see the New York City subway system filled with the Atlantic Ocean was to be reminded in no uncertain terms of the fragility of this arrangement that we call civilization in the face of the change that we are now making. A change that, unless we get to work very, very rapidly, will be very, very much worse. We've raised the temperature 1 degree. The same scientists who told us that that would happen and predicted its results, predicted them, by the way, with fairly eerie specificity. You can go find lots of reports saying which subway stations in New York City were going to flood when the first big storm came, and they were exactly right about what was going to go on. Okay? The same scientists told us all that. Now tell us with robust confidence that unless we stop burning coal and gas and oil far more quickly than any government currently plans to, that 1 degree will be 4 or 5 degrees before the youngest people in this room are old people. And there is no reason to think that our civilization can even begin to cope with change on that scale. The agronomists, Stanford, the University of Washington, put out a study 2 years ago now. It said from this point on, they just didn't even look at drought and flood. They just looked at what happens to our main grain crops as the temperature rises, okay? Because those evolved over the last 10,000 years to be, used to the climate that we've had. What they found was that from this point on, each degree increase in global average temperature should cut grain yields about 10%. And watching what happened in Iowa last summer, it's easy to see how that could happen. Try to imagine the planet that we're on, with all that you know about it, with a temperature 2 or 3 degrees higher and therefore 20 or 30% fewer calories. Okay? Just run that in your mind and try to figure out whether any of the things you care about development, about public health, about war and peace, can possibly be sustained in that kind of world. I don't think they can. This is the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, by far. The most important thing that happened in the lifetime of everyone in this room was that we left behind the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of human civilization, and now we've moved into something else, and the only question is how far into it we're going to move, so the stakes are enormous. Enormous and very basic. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put out a study in January saying that the world had grown hot enough and muggy enough already that the capacity of human beings to work outdoors was already been reduced about 10%, and by mid-century on current trends would be reduced about 30%. That's about as basic as it gets, The idea that we're making it too hot for us to go outside and do what human beings have always done, raise the food we need to feed ourselves, whatever it is. So, the really grim stuff's over now, and we'll move on a little bit to a slightly different sort of order of grimness, which is about trying to answer the question of why we haven't done anything about this so far. Okay? It's not for lack of warning. Scientists, this was a remarkable case of science telling us precisely what we needed to know. And the amazing amount of human brain power put to work on this project, beginning a long time ago, beginning in 1890s when Arrhenius, the great Swedish chemist, first did the kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations about what would happen if we continued, as he put it, to evaporate our coal mines into the air. We knew already that the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat, and so he was able to calculate numbers that come not that far from what our supercomputers now tell us about what the future holds, By 1988, James Hansen, our greatest scientific hero, testified before Congress. He said, it's time to stop waffling and say that the planet's heating up and that we're the cause. And then the rest of the scientific community, in the powerful dialectic that they employ, tried to knock him down, That's how it's supposed to work in that community, and they did their best. And by 1995, the rest of the world scientific community was, okay, this is correct. This is what's going on. We need to get to work. But we didn't get to work. We didn't get to work anywhere, especially in the United States. We've had a 25-year bipartisan effort in Washington to accomplish nothing, and it's been entirely successful, okay? And one needs to ask why that is. And we could come up with a long list of reasons, but frankly, the biggest one, the most important one, is that the richest industry on earth has been able to completely block change of any significant kind. The fossil fuel industry has all the money. I mean, almost literally. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money, okay? They are the 1% of the 1%. And, of course, it only takes a little bit of that money to corrupt political systems enough to make sure that change doesn't happen. Keeping change from happening is a relatively easy thing to do, at least compared with trying to make change happen. Okay? So they've been up to the task so far. They've been able to defend the greatest special privilege that there ever was and the source of their great wealth, which is that they're the one industry that gets to throw out their waste for free. They're allowed to pour carbon into the atmosphere without cost. And every economist that I know of in this country 25 years ago started saying this is an externality, to use their language, that we must force them to internalize. They have to pay the price of carbon. Otherwise, it'll forever be an unfair competition with the kind of energy sources that don't pour carbon into the atmosphere. Okay? But the fossil fuel industry has been sufficiently skilled to keep that from happening. There was an interesting expose today, and a very good one, about what's been going on in California, where Chevron, the oil company, who gave the largest campaign donation in the post-Citizens United world, where Chevron's been battling to undermine California's environmental regulations with some success. And there was just a fascinating quote in it from a vice president of Chevron who had since quit. And he said, if you're an oil company, what you want is for nothing ever to change. And that's absolutely right. And you want it because you are an absolutely stripped down and incredibly simple machine with only one goal in mind, which is to make more money. The CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson, gave an interview on Charlie Rose 2 or 3 weeks ago. And Charlie Rose tossed him a real softball question. He said, tell me what your philosophy is. And I think he expected he would say something about helping improve the world. Or he said, looked him straight in the eye and said, my philosophy is to make money. Okay? And that's exactly right. High marks for honesty. And the way that they make money is that they burn stuff, they dig stuff up for us to burn. I did a piece last summer for Rolling Stone that went strangely viral. It became the point of the piece, the burden of the piece, was that there was new data assembled by a bunch of financial analysts that demonstrated quite compellingly that the fossil fuel industry now had 5 times as much coal and oil and gas in their reserves as even the most conservative governments or scientists on Earth think is safe to burn. 5 times what is necessary to take us past the 2-degree threshold that's already an alarmingly high target for temperature increase. In other words, it's a rogue industry. These are outlaw companies, not outlaw against the laws of the state, because they get to write those, but outlaw against the laws of physics, okay? And hence need to be opposed. That's why we weren't getting anywhere. It wasn't because the scientists hadn't won the argument and the economists hadn't put out the policy that we needed and so on. It was because we were overwhelmed by the money that came from the other side. And I'd spent most of my adult life writing about these things, but it hadn't occurred to me that my job would be to try and figure out how to do something about it. I thought my function was to write. But at a certain point, I figured out we were just losing and that we needed to do something different. And I didn't know what, because, I'd read a little bit about Gandhi and stuff, but I didn't really know how to do any of this stuff. But I came back from that trip that John described to Bangladesh, having watched all these people die from dengue fever, and it's completely horrible to do it horrible any place, but to do it in Bangladesh. There's 150 million people there, but when the UN tries to measure how much carbon they've emitted, you can't even get a number. It's just a rounding error. They don't burn enough fossil fuel to even matter, and yet they're paying huge price. We're responsible for upwards of a third of all the CO2 currently in the atmosphere, the 4% of us who live in the United States. This is our legacy, our main legacy to the world, really, at this point. So I wanted to do something, but I had no idea how to do this. Sue will remember, my first thought was I would call a few of my writer friends up in Vermont. Said, we're going to go up to the federal building in Burlington, which is our main city. It's only got 50,000 people, so not that main, but it's what we've got, and we'll go up there and we'll sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a story in the newspaper, and at least we will have done something, And these guys, all these writers, as clueless as I was, that's a good idea, let's do that. But one of them thought to call up to the police in Burlington, say, what would happen were we to pull off this intrepid stunt, And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, So we had to recalibrate, and we left. We did that. I just emailed everybody I know and said we're going to go for a walk. We left from Robert Frost's old summer riding cabin up in the Green Mountains. We walked for 5 days north to Burlington and slept in farm fields at night. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher sometimes, so I'd called up the Methodist Mafia en route to make sure they'd be potluck suppers, which kind of the Methodist sacrament, would be available as we walked. And by the time we got to Burlington, there were 1,000 people marching, which for Vermont is only like the University of Vermont hockey game would draw more people than that at one time. In fact, we got to the outskirts of town, and my great friend and our greatest political leader, I think, Bernie Sanders, was there to greet us. And Bernie, an old-time organizer, was as happy as he could be. He was sort of bouncing up and down. He said, this is great. I haven't seen anything like this since Vietnam. This is so great. What is this about again? He said. He's since gone on to be just our greatest climate champion in the whole Senate. Just wonderful. But the thing that was depressing was to open the newspaper the next day and read this story that said that 1,000 people that gathered there was probably the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the United States. This was 2006. When I read that, I thought, no wonder we lose. We've got the superstructure of a movement. We've got Al Gore, we've got the scientists, we've got the policy people. The only part of the movement we forgot was the movement part. There's nothing there, and that's what we're going to have to build. So that's what we started trying to build. At 350.org, we started shortly after. And when I say we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College, 7 seniors, which we had no money or organization or anything. We had this name, which we took from Jim Hansen, who told us 350 parts per million CO2 was the most we could safely have in the atmosphere, a number we're already sadly well north of. We took it mostly because we wanted to organize globally, and the thing we were most worried about was how we would communicate across language barriers, and Arabic numerals travel, as you saw in that beautiful video that someone put together at the beginning. All over the world, people figured out what these numbers meant and went to work. It was, when we started, we had there were 7 undergraduates and there were 7 continents, so each one took one, and the guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, and we set out, and within a year we had this first big day of action, which had 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries, and one of the things.
Rabbi Elmer Berger was born in May of 1908. He died in the mid-1990s. He did live long enough to see the revival of anti-Zionism.
In the 40s, you were opposed to the Declaration of Independence of Israel.
Yes, but I don't like to leave it at that. We thought, and I don't like to put on the mantle of a prophet, but when I started this anti-Zionist work in an organized way in 1943, many of the positions that we took now proved to be prophetic. We did not believe that this could be done peacefully. The collapse of the United Nations effort, you know, the partition recommendation of 1947 was to be implemented only if it could be done peacefully. And in April of 1948, it was already apparent that there could be no peaceful acceptance by the Arabs of an arbitrary partition of a country that they considered was their right by having lived there for 1,300 years, something of that kind. And so our position then was that Palestine should become a democratic state in which full citizenship rights and responsibilities should be available to all citizens, regardless of race, ethnic origin, or religion.
A state with equal democratic rights for all. If only world leaders had listened to Rabbi Elmer Berger in the 1940s. We'll be talking about these issues at the Left Forum that occurs the weekend, June 7th through 9th in New York. And the Middle East Crisis Committee will have a forum about one state. Speaking of tributes, here's one to Stephen Hawking, the genius physicist who canceled his appearance at a Jerusalem conference in protest of treatment of Palestinians. ALS prevents him from speaking, but here's what he wrote. I accepted the invitation to the presidential conference with the intention that this would not only allow me to express my opinion on the prospects for a peace settlement, but also because it would allow me to lecture on the West Bank. However, I received a number of emails from Palestinian academics. They are unanimous that I should respect the boycott. In view of this, I must withdraw from the conference. Had I attended, I would have stated my opinion that the policy of the present Israeli government is likely to lead to disaster. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.